everyone, and welcome to another episode of Awesome Albums with Awesome Andrew. Last time I talked about the artists who got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in this year of 2017. I was going to pick an album by one of those artists and talk about it in today's episode. I'm hoping by holding up this album, in the back of your minds you're thinking, yes! Because that is who I went with. Yes, and their album, Fragile. As always, before I go any further, I must introduce the band. First up, we have John Anderson, our primary vocalist. Chris Squire on bass and has some vocals as well. Steve Howe on acoustic and electric guitar and also has some vocals. Bill Bruford on drums and percussion. And their newest addition to the group, Rick Wakeman on organ, grand piano, electric piano, harpsichord, mellotron, and synthesizer. Before jumping into the music, let's talk about the events that led up to the creation of this album. On July 31st, 1971, Yes performed their final concert of their 1970-1971 tour of Europe and North America at Crystal Palace Park to support the Yes album, their third album, released in 1971. Following that tour, Yes started work on their next studio record, which was originally planned to be a double album with a combination of studio and live tracks. Unfortunately, they were not able to do this because the time it would take to make it. Their plans of recording the album in Miami, Florida with producer Tom Dowd also fell through. They started rehearsing in August of '71 in what Squire described as a little rehearsal studio in Shepherd's Market in London. There have been disputes going on with their original keyboardist and founding member, Tony Kaye, who was reluctant to expand his sound beyond his Hammond organ and piano to play newer instruments like the mellotron or the Moog synthesizer, and was basically let go. Yes found a replacement in the classically trained Rick Wakeman, who was originally in the folk rock band called Strawbs. Wakeman joined the group as they rehearsed Heart of the Sunrise. Squire recalls on their session saying that marked the first real appearance of the mellotron and the Moog, adding the flavor of those instruments to a piece we basically already worked out. And according to Wakeman, the basis of Roundabout was also put down on that same day. They finally got to start recording the album in September of '71 at Vision Studios using a 16-track tape machine. Eddie Alford, who served as a recording engineer on Yes's second album, Time and a Word, in 1970, assumed his role while sharing production duties with the band. While the band was recording, Wakeman remembered children being brought into the studio to watch them play. According to Rolling Stone magazine, the album cost $30,000 to produce. The album was finally released in November of '71 in the UK, and it was planned to be released in the US around that same time, but delays in printing of the cover led to its release being pushed back to January 4th of 1972. And speaking of that album cover, the album sleeve was designed and illustrated by English artist Roger Dean, who would design many of Yes's future album covers, including their famous bubble logo. Dean said Fragile was very literal, really. I think the band has named a number of their albums after their current psychological state, and Fragile described the psyche of the band, and I thought about that very literally, painting a fragile world that would eventually break up." End quote. To go along with what Dean said, it makes me wonder if that's the inspiration for 1972's Close to the Edge and 1980's Drama, where the names of the albums are descriptions of their psychological state in those times. Dean also comments further and says, Fragile was quite a complicated cover because there was a book inside. It was elaborate enough, although it wasn't one of the most striking of all of Yes's covers. It was kind of learning my trade at the time. The main feature on the cover was a little bonsai world with a wooden spaceship flying overhead. It was literally meant to be a fragile world. End quote. Michael Tate, the band's lighting director, has a different story on where the title for Fragile came from. He says the title came from manager Brian Lane, who, while on the phone to some press guy, asking Lane about the new album, was looking at some photos from the Crystal Palace gig, saw the monitors at the front of the stage, and, like all the equipment, they had Fragile stamped on the back. Bruford claimed he in fact came up with the title because he thought the band was unbreakable at that time. The band's idea for the cover was very different than the final product, however. The band wanted an image of a fractured piece of porcelain. To compromise, Dean ended up breaking the planet into two pieces, as you can actually see on the back cover, where there are holes in the planet and there's a good-sized chunk of broken off, and you also have a profile view of the wooden spaceship in the shape of a fish. The idea of this broken world would continue onto the band's live album, Yes Songs, Bruford thought Dean brilliantly parlayed the idea up to the prescient image of the fragile planet Earth with implications of a delicate and breakable ecosystem. End quote. The album also has a gatefold. One side has the personnel listing and some facts about some of the songs. Don't worry, I'll cover those in the music segment of this video. But to sum it up, there were 5 songs that were solo features written by each member of the band, and the 4 remaining songs are group arranged and performed. Those 4 songs have their lyrics featured on the other half of the gatefold. Interestingly, the solo tracks were actually a necessity. They needed to hurry and get Fragile released as soon as possible to cover the cost of the keyboards that Wakeman had added to the group, but the songs are so much more than just filler. A couple of solo works are seen as some of the album's best pieces. And I guess it's time to get started talking about some of these pieces. This album has such a powerful opening song. The eerie intro to the song is a single note on the piano, recorded and played backwards. Eddie Olford spent a lot of time stringing up the tape the wrong way and picking out just the right notes to make it work. Roundabout is seen as the ultimate Journey song, a musical odyssey which moves from Steve Howe's signature classical guitar intro to a frantic bass-driven riff by Chris Squire to an even more frantic organ solo by Wakeman, which we will hear in a couple minutes. The lyrics were written by Anderson and inspired by a long tour ride through Scotland, which alternated between stretches with mountain and lake scenery, and of course the traffic-clogged roundabouts. However, a competing explanation is that the song was written on the train as they were traveling to the Montreux Jazz Festival. About halfway through, the song gets quiet. Anderson quietly sings the chorus.
And around the lake, mountains come out of the sky, they stand there.
But then the music swells up and the song is back to full volume, and you have an epic instrumental break. Let's listen to part of that. Some of the lyrics Anderson quoted specifically from the song. In the first scenario of driving through Scotland, he was traveling from Aberdeen to Glasgow and started singing the song with Steve in the back of a van. He was describing the scenery with the mountains on the cloudy day. He points out, "Oh, the mountains! Look, they're coming out of the sky!" So that became some of the lyrics in the chorus. Mountains coming out of the sky, they stand there. He also described the roundabout right at the bottom of the road, which was a landmark for him. That means in 24 hours, he'll be back in London. In 24 hours, he'll be back home to his loved one, Jennifer. The song ends with some great vocalizing. Such a great song eventually released as a single, which reached number 13 in the US and was their biggest song until Owner of a Lonely Heart in 1983. Cans and Brahms was Rick Wakeman's solo contribution to the album. He plays on an electric piano, taking the part of the strings, grand piano replacing the woodwind, organ replacing the brass, electric harpsichord replacing the reeds, and synthesizer replacing the contrabassoon. This information was paraphrased from the album's gatefold. Although this short instrumental piece goes in a completely different direction from Roundabout, it really does fit in the larger context of this album. Wakeman later described the track as dreadful, as contractual problems with A&M Records, for whom he was a solo artist, prevented him from writing a composition of his own, which is why he arranged a classical piece taking parts from Johannes Brahms' Fourth Symphony in E minor, Third Movement. We Have Heaven is Anderson's solo contribution to the album. The gatefold tells us that he does all the vocals here. It's a little hard to understand the lyrics since there are 2 main chants going on at the same time, along with the song ends with a door slam and someone running away. As much as I love Roundabout, I think this might be my favorite track on the album. It's so interesting musically. South Side of the Sky seems to predate the syncopate music of future bands like Devo. The 8-minute track contains many musical forays and sound effects, including the fine piano by Wakeman and wordless harmonies by Anderson, Howe, and Squire during the middle section. I love this middle section between the wind blowing and the piano and the vocalizing. Let's listen to part of this. After some vocalizing, the piano comes back for a second time, and the music swells up and jumps back into the vocals. When Yes performed this song at the Montreux Jazz Festival in 2003, Anderson said, "This is a song about climbing mountains. It's dangerous, but we must climb mountains every day." The liner notes to the remastered version of Fragile, however, aren't as optimistic, describing a polar expedition that ends in death. Well, no matter what the song is about, it's really cool and highly underrated. This short track is Bruford's contribution. He says it's his first attempt composition, but we've all got to start somewhere. According to Michael Tate, its original title was Suddenly It's Wednesday, but was changed in reference to Yes paying off their former manager Roy Flynn with a deal of 5% of future royalties. So basically, he's getting 5% for doing nothing. The gatefold says 5% for Nothing is a 16-bar tune by Bill Bruford, played twice by the group and taken directly from the percussion line. The single for Long Distance Runaround is the B-side to Roundabout. It has one of the most unusual sounds on the album. It's very catchy and became a major hit, and unlike Roundabout, it's short enough that it didn't need to be edited. The song is seen as the most pop-oriented song on the album. The song may be the best example of the band's tightness, as Hal's bright and economical guitar cutting is counteracted by Squire and Bruford's simultaneous complex rhythms without a single moment of confusion. John Anderson said, "It was how religion had seemed to confuse me totally. It was such a game that seemed to be played, and I was going around in circles looking for the sound of reality, the sound of God. That was my interpretation of the song, that I was always confused. I could never understand the things that religion stood for, and that throughout the years has always popped its head up in the song I've been working with." End quote. Lastly, the writing of the song is solely credited to Anderson, which caused a bit of tension with the rest of the group, as mentioned by Steve Howe. Lots of work was done on songs like Long Distance Runaround, where the first riff was collaborative. It was a bit of mine, and Bill was humming, and Rick was harmonizing. End quote. Long Distance Runaround transitions into Chris Squire's solo contribution. Michael Tate recalls Anderson calling him up at 10 o'clock one night from Advision and said, "I want the name of the prehistoric fish in 8 syllables. Call me back in a half hour." And Tate found the, and I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, Schindleria primaturus from the Guinness Book of Records. It's an obscure fish from the Pacific Ocean where the adult fish exhibits no adult characteristics, only juvenile characteristics. A slight variation of the story was Chris Squire had the melody and wanted to sing about a fish that had 8 syllables and dispatched a roadie, maybe Tate, to go find one. The best he could do was find a 9-syllable fish, which is why the last syllable kind of trails off in the song. Outside of the fish being repeated over and over, it's essentially an instrumental. The title comes from Chris Squire's nickname. He was called the Fish because of his tendency to take long baths, and he also happens to be a Pisces. We have our final solo contribution to the album, written by Steve Howe. He performs this piece on a Conde flamenco guitar. It's a very relaxing piece that sounds like a cross between a warm-up and a heartfelt recital. It's a great example that shows just how talented Howe is as a guitar player. Heart of the Sunrise is a neat track that really brought all of Wakeman's classical trained background into play. He introduced the band to the idea of recapitulation, where previous segments in music are revisited. The song starts off with Squire and Bruford offering one last intense riff sequence to launch this closing track. The track is also filled with changing type signatures, leads, Wakeman's juggling of organ, synthesizer, and piano. Chris Squire wrote the main riff of the song, which Steve Howe thought was influenced by King Crimson's 21st Century Schizoid Man. The vocals come in at 3:40, giving it one of the longest intros in rock history. Both John Anderson and Chris Squire said this is one of their favorite Yes songs. Squire says it was the most complete but precise example of what Yes was doing. Anderson said, Heart of the Sunrise is a great piece. One of the things that was always important for Yes was to create music for the stage to perform, not to make a record. We were very lucky to go into the studio and make records, but our main game was to put on a show and entertain the audience, and in doing so, we put that into the record. So by 71, 72, we were stretching our wings to do longer form pieces on stage. I got into this whole thing about doing a 20-minute piece because in those days you could only put 20 minutes on each side of an album. If it had been 30 minutes, it would have been a 30-minute piece. He also said, I'd been listening to a lot of Stravinsky at the time, and the band were fans of modern music at that time. Weather Report and bands like that were doing far-reaching jazz rock influenced music, so we were jumping into different structural compositions. One last quote that he says about the song is, it rings true to my chakra energy, my consciousness, end quote. He gets a lot of inspiration and energy from the earth and the cosmos, which is of course reflected in this song. The song ends and we still have about a minute left where a hidden track comes in. Remember how We Have Heaven ended in a door slamming? Well, that door just got opened up for the song to reprise. This track was not referred on the album's track listing, which is why it's called a hidden track. Future releases of the album tack this hidden track to the end of Heart of the Sunrise and extends the song from 10:34 to about 11:27, making it their longest song up to that point, which has been surpassed multiple times since then. The album has seen massive commercial and critical success, reaching number 4 on the US Billboard Top LPs and reached number 7 on the UK Albums chart. The album is certified double platinum for selling over 2 million copies. Billboard magazine selected the album in its Billboard Pick feature, describing it as a vibrant, soothing, tumultuous, placid, and instrumentally brilliant. In 2005, Fragile was included in the musical reference book 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. Bruce Etter, in his review for AllMusic, gave the album 5 out of 5 stars. He writes, Fragile was Yes's breakthrough album, propelling them in a matter of weeks from a cult act to an international phenomenon. Not coincidentally, it also marked a point where all of the elements of the music, and more, that would define their success for more than a decade fell into place fully formed. The science fiction and fantasy elements that had driven the more successful songs on the Yes album were pushed much harder here, and not just in the music, but in the packaging of the album. The Roger Dean designed cover was itself a fascinating creation that seemed to relate to the music and drew to the purchaser's attention in a manner that few records since the heyday of the psychedelic era could match. End quote from AllMusic. Are you convinced yet? It's a really good album, and this is just one of the many great albums released by Yes, and definitely deserves a spot in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. This has been Awesome Andrew reminding you that Yes's Fragile is an awesome album. I'll see you guys next time.